It's today's equivalent of tapping out Morse code on a flashlight. Find out how data was beamed across a city skyline by a spatially modulated green laser. That and news from Neuroscience 2014, today on Light Matters. This is Light Matters for November 19th, 2014. I'm Laura Marshall.
And I'm James Lowe. On this week's show, we share another interview in our EDU Spotlight series, and Laura reports on Neuroscience 2014. But first, we look at how spatially modulated beams of light were used to transmit images through the air, and how mid-infrared lasers were used to create high-flux X-ray pulses. With twisted beams of light, images have been transmitted through the air at a distance of over 3 kilometers. This demonstrates the significant data carrying capacity of light in free space communications. Scientists from the Institute for Quantum Optics and Quantum Information in Vienna did this by first adjusting the spatial modulation of a green laser beam. 16 laser modes were used to encode real information, including grayscale images of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Ludwig Boltzmann, and Erwin Schrödinger. Previously, this was only possible over short distances in laboratory settings. An artificial neural network revealed the patterns and corrected any disturbances caused by air turbulence. If a light beam of a certain wavelength is twisted into a corkscrew shape, the number of channels through which data can be transmitted is drastically increased. Called orbital angular momentum, or OAM, this phenomenon has been used to transmit up to 2.5 terabits per second through optical fibers. Theoretically, the light can be twisted with an infinite number of turns, with each configuration acting as a single communication channel. The additional degree of freedom could significantly increase data rates, even in classical communications, and could heighten security in quantum encryption. The research was published in the New Journal of Physics.
A high-intensity mid-infrared laser system now allows scientists to study time-dependent incidents on short timescales, which could ultimately provide more accurate measurements and imaging in medicine and materials science. Developed at Vienna University of Technology, the hard X-ray plasma source is driven by intense sub-100 femtosecond pulses at 3.9 micron wavelengths. This is 5 times longer than the wavelength of lasers typically used to create X-rays and translates to an X-ray flux 25 times higher. The laser works by emitting mid-IR light that hits a copper plate. The intensity of that light is so high that electrons are ripped out of the atoms. The laser field turns the electrons around and accelerates them, prompting them to hit the copper plate again at very high energies. During this impact, X-ray radiation is emitted. The researchers are now pushing for even longer wavelengths and increases in the laser pulse rate. The research was published in Nature Photonics.
An airplane's landing gear takes a beating when it touches down on the tarmac, and replacing it is expensive. Doctoral student Stephen Sun of RMIT University in Australia thinks laser cladding might present an inexpensive means of repair. I caught up with him after his talk at ICALIO for this week's EDU Spotlight.
So laser cladding is a process where the laser beam melts alloy, a powder. So the powder will melt and fuse in with the substrate, creating what's called a clad layer. And that's basically, the aim is to restore the geometry and also restore the mechanical and fatigue properties. Imagine you have a landing gear, okay? So you have a damage on the surface of the landing gear. So what the process will involve is you remove the damage. So let's just say if there's a crack size of about 0.45 mil, you remove the damage using a grind out, and then you rebuild the geometry using laser cladding. So what the repair does is actually try to make it as good as new. So basically restore the geometry wise, so there's no stress concentration at all, and that will basically improve the fatigue life. So because you're changing the microstructure. If microstructure is different, then it makes it a very complicated issue. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
Laura was on the road yet again over the weekend to attend the Society for Neuroscience annual meeting in Washington, D.C. Laura, what can you tell us about the conference?
Well, James, one of the real highlights at Neuroscience 2014 was a Meet the Expert lecture by Dr. Mark Schnitzer of Stanford University, who discussed his team's research work on tiny portable and implantable microscopes. That work started 10 years ago and has grown to allow them to image cells in freely behaving mice. The wearable microscopes are based on blue LEDs and cell phone CMOS sensors. A general problem in imaging moving animals is that there's so much instability, Schnitzer noted. You have to worry about the movement of the brain relative to the cranium, as well as the movement of the cranium relative to the optical axis. With their implantable microendoscopes, you don't have to worry about the latter, because the instrument is fixed to the cranium. The stability isn't quite robust enough for super-resolution techniques such as STED or PALM because it's not really feasible to dampen brain motion to that level in a behaving animal, but Schnitzer pointed out that free behavior isn't necessarily the best context for super-resolution microscopy anyway. Interestingly, there's been a change in attitude toward the microendoscope as the technology evolved, he added. At first they were expensive to make and delicate, so he and his team would treat the endoscopes so carefully. They couldn't afford to break them or throw them away because they needed to reuse them as much as possible. But today, he said, they're seen more as a consumable. Each mouse can have its own microendoscope, and the instruments can be permanently implanted. The technology has led to a spin-off, Inscopics, which had a booth in the bustling Neuroscience exhibit hall. And it really was bustling. Companies from all over the world demonstrated neuroscience-related products of all kinds, photonic and otherwise. Attendance at the conference was around 30,000 over the weekend, which meant crowded walkways and busy booths in the exhibition. Company reps I visited said they've been developing products with user-friendliness and plug-and-play modularity in mind, something I've heard again and again at photonics trade shows in the last few years. Looks like the trend is continuing, and that's a really good thing. Speaking of good things, while in DC, I attended OSA's Rising Stars panel, a new press briefing event featuring 3 young female scientists and innovators who have already made great advances in the science of light. The Rising Stars explained their highly specialized work and discussed unique challenges faced by women in science. We'll have more on the panel next week, but for now, here's a clip of silicon photonics expert Dr. Jessie Rosenberg discussing what initially attracted her to optics and photonics.
I mean, this is one thing that I thought when I was going into graduate school, trying to decide what I was going to do. And I heard the talks of all the professors saying everything that they're doing, and, you know, of course every field was very interesting. But optics I thought was particularly exciting because, as a physicist, you know, I got to do all of the, you know, detailed physics that I wanted to do, but I also got to be kind of an engineer. You know, really down in there using Maxwell's equations to make something that has a big impact on the real world.
That's it for this week's show.
Email us with questions or comments at lightmatters@photonics.com. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and now Google+ for updates every day.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you again next week.